Okay, I guess we are live on YouTube, but that's okay if some of you are talking. It just says there are people here. Okay, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a few here tonight, and maybe this will grow, and if not, that's okay, because I know some of you are more comfortable watching at home, but we'll just do it that way. And if for any reason, those of you who are here have a thought or whatever, just kind of whatever with your hand, and I would love to hear it, and I'll repeat it so that those watching at home, can hear what's being said as well. But we'll get started with a word of prayer, and we'll go from there. So, dear Lord, we thank you for this time to come together in your house. And your word says where 2 or 3 are gathered, that you're there in their midst. And I thank you, Lord, for that promise. And I just pray that your Holy Spirit would move here tonight and that your words would be what is spoken. I thank you for your word and for all the truth that there is in it for us to learn from and to grow from. And I pray that that would be the case tonight, that as we search your word, that you would show us truth and something that we can apply to our own lives. I pray, Lord, for those concerns. There are so many, Lord, you know what they are, and I thank you that you're a God that can be in all of those places at once. I thank you especially for carrying my husband through the surgery on Monday and for taking care of that, and pray for continued healing there. And another prayer concern I had for a young man tonight, Lord, who's being told he may lose his foot due to an infection. I just pray, Lord, that you would bring healing there and just be real to him. I know he's going through a hard walk in his life right now. Just reveal yourself to him. And Lord, many, many others, yet you're a God who's over it all. And we leave them in your hands tonight. We thank you and praise you for all you are and all that you are going to do in the future. In your holy and precious name, amen. Okay, so for several weeks we've been going through a study of the life of David in comparison to the Psalms. And so that I'm in complete disclosure tonight, I cannot find a psalm that goes with this particular event in David's life. So on Monday, I skipped right over it and went to the next one where there was a psalm in conjunction with it, and I just couldn't do it. I could not skip. It was like it went from 1 Samuel 24 to 1 Samuel 26, and then there was another psalm. But 1 Samuel 25 was completely left out. And so I did a ton of research, and I cannot find one psalm that necessarily connects. And many people, say, well, this one or this one, and I'm like, no, not exactly. So that's really pulling it. But it doesn't matter, because we can still totally see God working in 1 Samuel 25, and it is absolutely one of my favorite passages, because this is where we find the story of David and Abigail. And so I just could not skip this, and I love the truth that we find in there about what David was dealing with and kind of his battle with the flesh, and so that'll give us kind of something interesting to look at. But we're going to be in 1 Samuel 25 for anybody who, has a Bible and can follow along, or if you're just listening at home or listening on another day, that's fine. I will try to be clear as I read. But being a Bible study, I like it to be in the Bible. So again, I say over and over and over again, and I cannot say it enough. I feel for too many years of my years growing up in the church, it became too much about man's opinion and no longer about the Bible. And I'm one of those people who are like, you know what? I think we've messed it up long enough. Let's get back to what the Bible actually says. And so there might be a lot of older pastors who might not like me saying that, but I don't really care, because I've heard a lot of opinions. And I'm just saying this is what the Bible says, whether we like it or not. So starting in 1 Samuel 25, it says, kind of starting on a sad note, Samuel died, and all Israel assembled to mourn for him, and they buried him by his home in Ramah. David then went down to the wilderness of Paran. Okay, so there's kind of this one little verse that gives you an idea of the time period and kind of what is now happening. Now, last week we talked about, and to give a little bit of review, last week we talked about how David and his men were all hiding in the back of a cave, and Saul enters the cave, to rest and to relieve himself and whatever, and that is where David, sneaks up and cuts off a part of his outer garment, and then his conscience hits him, and what have I done? and I shouldn't have done this. And he steps out and he makes that right. Okay, so Saul has once again said, okay, what am I doing? My son David, and he, begs for his forgiveness, and Saul returns home and gives up the hunt for now. We're going to see he's not done. When evil sets in, evil sets in. So in the meantime, though, then we see that Samuel has died. Now we know that Samuel is the priest who ordained David, who anointed him as the next king of Israel. But Samuel was a very, very, very well-known priest and very loved. And so this was a great time of mourning for all of Israel to lose their priest. And I am sure that as David got word of this and knew this was happening, this was a great time of mourning for David as well, that a great man of God, had passed on. And so we see that little, that one little verse that points out that this has happened, okay? And then the story continues. And in verse 2 of chapter 25, it says, a man in Maon had a business in Carmel. He was a very rich man with 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Okay, so now a lot of people read this and they think the Mount Carmel. These were, Maon and Carmel were just two little cities that were within the tribe of Judah. Okay, so they were part of, the land that the tribe of Judah owned, and these were two small cities within there. And this was an area, David was from the tribe of Judah, and so this was an area where he and his men kind of tended to be at and hiding out amongst, the wilderness areas and the trees or the caves. So anyways, here was this man, and it says in verse 3, the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name Abigail. Now, it starts there. It says his name was Nabal, hers was Abigail, but then it starts to give us a little bit of a description of Abigail. And it says, the woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, was harsh and evil in his dealings. Now, when we look at that term, a Calebite, okay, there are a lot of things that can be brought to mind, but one of the things that many historians all agree upon was that would have been a term used for a dog, like somebody to be completely disregarded. And that's kind of what many believe this was used in relation to Nabal, is he was not a man even worth talking about. He was harsh and he was evil. He was not a good person. However, it gives us the contradiction that his wife, on the other hand, was intelligent and beautiful. And so, highly spoken words of her, and we'll see that later she lives up to that description. So it says, while David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So David sent 10 young men, instructing them, go up to Carmel, and when you come to Nabal, greet him in my name. So go ahead, let him know who you are and who you're coming for. Go ahead and greet him in my name. So understand, this was a great time of, they're shearing the sheep. This is time to bring in the money. Okay, they've been waiting for this time, and now it's time to, basically reap what they've sown in a sense, but this is now in animal terms. And so this would have been a great festival and a great party, and all this was going on, and David and his men are seeking some help. And so he sends 10 of them in and says, go speak to him and greet him in my name. And then he said, then say this, long life to you and peace to your family and peace to all that is yours. I hear that you are shearing. When your shepherds were with us, we did not harass them, and nothing of theirs was missing the whole time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. So let my young men find favor with you, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have on hand to your servants and to your son David. So he sends them with this message. Go to them and greet them with peace and prosperity, send them a very welcome, humble greeting to who they are. And then ask them, for basically food is what they were saying, because this is feast day. But then remind him that we've done him a great service. And that's going to clarify later, because we're going to see one of Nabal's servants offering up more information about that. But what David was alluding to, so we can have this as our mindset as we look into this, is, you can imagine that Nabal would send his shepherds out. And with their great, obviously he has a lot of animals. And so this would be a great herd of animals out there. And so they'd be out getting them, pastures to feed in and water to drink. And that was not an easy job. And sometimes that territory wasn't the most forgiving. But they'd be out there and they'd be doing this. And when they're out there protecting the sheep, their goal is not to necessarily protect the enemy. And so there were other neighboring nations that were very well known for just coming in and taking from them, possibly taking goods, their food, or possibly even stealing the animals. And so this happened to these shepherds a lot. And what David is saying is that, my men and I, we protected them. And that becomes a little clearer as this passage goes on as to what kind of protection that David and his men offered these shepherds. And I just loved this because I thought, if we go all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the beginning of the story of David, and when we see Samuel, we talked about earlier, passing away, and God has told Samuel, go, because one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king, and here he is it this one? No. This one? No. And he goes down the whole row until he says, Jesse, do you have any more sons? Well, I've got this little one, David, but he's out with the sheep. We let him tend the sheep. So when this story comes up, you see something that is something very familiar to David, something dear to David's heart, watching the sheep, protecting the sheep. And he knew what kind of an important job that was. And so here he is with 600 men, all needing taken care of, and he could have just as easily have been one of the ones taking from these shepherds out, watching these sheep, but he didn't. Instead, we'll see a pretty good description of how he not only did not take from them, but he protected them and took care of them. So he doesn't give this whole story. He just tells these 10 men, he said, let him know that, go ahead, ask your servants. They'll tell you what we did for them. So there at the end of verse 8, I do believe, he says, please give whatever you have on hand to your servants and to your son David. This was just such a humble way of David approaching this man, who in many ways, owed him a favor. And this wouldn't have been odd for anybody to have asked a favor of someone like that, because word would have gotten back that, hey, we were pretty safe out there while we were out in the wilderness with the sheep because, David and his men took care of us. So, yet David comes so humbly, not demanding, and we see that heart of David. Now, this is going to be the passage where we saw a little touch of David's conscience where he kind of jumped and did something in the last chapter. But this is going to be a little bit more than just that little moment. We're going to see that humble side of David, that kind side of David, the flesh got the best of him here for a minute. Okay? And that's kind of a big warning. So anyways, this is where we are. So in verse 9, it says, David's young men went and said all these things to Nabal on David's behalf. And they waited. Nabal asked them, who is David? Who is Jesse's son? Many slaves these days are running away from their masters. Am I supposed to take my bread, my water, and my meat that I butchered from my shearers and give them to these men? I don't know where they're from. Ooh. Now, we have good idea that by this point in David's life, he is pretty popular. And people know who he is, including Nabal. Okay? And this was a direct insult for Nabal to insinuate, oh, really, who is he? And then to insinuate that, oh, he could just be some runaway slave for all I know. It was an arrogant insult to David. And it was harsh. And so it says, David's young men retraced their steps. So they go back to David. So when they returned to him, they reported all these words. So they told David, this is how he responded. We went, we gave him the direct message you told us to give him, and this is how he responded. This is what he said for us to tell you. We got nowhere with him, basically. So here it is. he said to his men, this is David, he said to his men, all of you, put on your swords. Wow. We're suddenly not dealing with the humble, kind David anymore. We're starting to see maybe a little bit more of the warrior David. So he tells all of his men, put on your swords. So now here's David with his 600 men. And he says, all of you put on your swords. And it says, so each man put on his sword, and David also put on his sword. Now it says about 400 men followed David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. So that gives us an idea of kind of what they were hauling around and carrying with them, that 200 were to stay and kind of protect that and keep an eye on their stuff and the things that they had. And meanwhile, here's David with 400 men, all heading towards Nabal. Now, it's easy to read this and we just don't get a picture in our mind, but can you imagine David and 600 men? I mean, come on. You knew who these guys were by this point. I mean, 600 men don't just sneak around and stay hidden all the time. And David is and we're going to see in a moment, that Abigail, that beautiful, intelligent woman we were talking about, she knew who he was. So don't tell me her husband didn't know who he was. And now he's mad because he's been insulted. He has been treated unfairly. He has been wronged. And, you know, we sit, in many of us, maybe we know the rest of the story. But what if we said we didn't know the rest of the story? And we, for a moment, had to stop and step back and say, have I ever had someone who has wronged me? I mean, they have completely wronged me. They have done something to me that was just not justifiable in any manner. And then stop and think, and what was my reaction? When were those times in my life where I let the flesh step in because I thought they needed put in their place? I needed to resolve this. I needed to let them know that what they did was wrong. Now, maybe we didn't pull out our sword, but maybe we did. You know, in the New Testament, it kind of relays the tongue to a sword, doesn't it? And often that is the sword that we instantly put on when we feel somebody has just downright wronged us. And we know in our heart of hearts that what they did was wrong. I mean, how they treated us, how they disrespected us, it was wrong. And we have that flesh that just builds up inside of us, and our instant reaction is we're going to draw out our sword. And we're going to put it on, and we're going to handle this. And we're going to put this person in their place because they deserve it. And that humble David, who sends his men in with this humble request, is suddenly gone. And suddenly he's bearing his sword and he's ready to go handle the problem. And I can be very honest and say that I know those times in my life where I have felt that they deserve this and they're going down. I mean, I can tend to be that kind of a person, you know. Thank God I have the Lord because, whoo, let me tell you, I know how to use the sword, the tongue. I do. And so I've also learned how to go, no, because in that moment, you let the flesh get out of control, and you're going to have a lot of regrets. And that was the trail, that was the path that David was on. And David wasn't on it alone. David had 400 men with him to help him carry it out. And I think here's David, and he's rallying up his men to go get revenge and to go get even. And sometimes we do the same thing. We get mad about this person who's wronged us, so we make sure we tell all our friends how they wronged us. We tell everybody what they've done, and then we make sure we have a good group of people behind us that know that we deserve revenge and know that we should get even and know we should make sure they are put in their place. We do the same thing. I mean, this may be on the big spectrum of it, you know. I doubt you have 400 friends that you're rallying to get behind you, but 4 can be just as dangerous as 400. And this is the path David is on. He is seeking revenge. So it says in verse 14, then in the meantime, one of Nabal's young men informed Abigail, Nabal's wife. So here's one of Nabal's young servants, you know, one of the young men that work for him, and he goes to Abigail, and he says, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed at them. The men treated us very well when we were in the field. We weren't harassed, and nothing of ours was missing the whole time we were living among them. So this guy starts to give a clearer picture to Abigail of what happened. You know, maybe Abigail didn't have word of what was happening while all these shepherds were out and about. But this young man is going, I need to talk to somebody reasonable, somebody intelligent. Now, we've already had that clarified about Abigail, the difference between Abigail and Nabal. That was right off the bat. So here we are, and he's saying, listen, these men, they never harassed us. They never took anything from among us. And in verse 16, he says, it's kind of like, and as a matter of fact, they were a wall around us both day and night. The entire time we were with them herding the sheep, they were a wall around us. That gives you the idea that here we were, and we were watching our sheep, and we were tending to their needs and to whatever, and David's men just surrounded us and protect us from anything that might come in and try to steal from us. Now, this isn't hard to imagine when suddenly we start talking in numbers of 600. And we start thinking of the humble David, the kind David, the shepherd David, who said, hey, fellas, let's spread out. Let's protect them. But now we've got a David who's ready to seek revenge to somebody who has done a great wrong to him. So this young servant is explaining this to Abigail, and he says, now consider carefully what you should do, because there is certain to be trouble for our master and his entire family. This young servant knew this is not going to go well. Now, how we know that he knew that, I don't know. Maybe word had gotten back. Maybe rumors were flying. Maybe it was just fear on his part, and maybe he was just reacting. Maybe we should do something. Maybe he didn't know for sure. But who didn't know for sure? God knew for sure. God knew there was trouble in hand and knew what David was about to do and how David was about to take matters into his own hand. And so this servant is saying, listen, you need to consider carefully what to do here, Abigail. Now, this is the time in history where we don't hear a whole lot about women. They weren't talked to a whole lot. We don't hear about what they did. And yet, this woman stood out and was a woman of intelligent reason and logic that this young man knew, I can go talk to her. She needs to consider what to do here. And then he follows up with, he is such a worthless fool. No one can talk to him. This young servant makes this pretty clear. There's no point in talking to Nabal. He's a worthless fool. He doesn't listen to anybody. And so he's saying he wouldn't listen to the young men that David sent. There's no point in me going and talking to him because he isn't going to listen to me. And Abigail, you know it. You're married to him. He's worthless. There's nothing anyone can say to him. Now, it's funny because the actual meaning of the name Nabal is fool. That's literally the meaning of the name, is fool. And if you kind of study that a little bit deeper, the way fool is kind of interpreted, it can be pretty, because you're going to see that in the version I'm using, it can interpret over to stupid pretty easy. That he was just stupid. He didn't make sense. And so here he is, rich. And I'm sure Abigail was probably passed off to him from her daddy for a great price because she was a beautiful young woman. But she was still an intelligent, beautiful young woman. And so he says, listen, you need to decide what you're going to do. So we see in verse 18, Abigail hurried, taking 200 loaves of bread. 200 loaves of bread. Now, for anybody who bakes, can you even imagine 200 loaves of bread? She starts with that, okay? 2 clay jars of wine, 5 butchered sheep, a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs. That's a lot of food. When you really think about that, that is a feast in and of itself. That's a lot of food. But we're thinking 600 men here, okay? And so it says all this, and then it says, and loaded them on donkeys. That's a lot of donkeys That's a lot of food. That's a lot of donkeys. I mean, it just kind of throws it out there, and you think this little donkey, but that's a lot of food. So this is quite an entourage, is my point, of a lot of food and a lot of animals, and you can imagine a lot of servants that were manning all of this, okay? And it says in verse 19, then she said to her male servants, go ahead of me. I will be right behind you. Okay, now she's saying, you guys go on ahead. I'll be right there. You know, now she knows that's going to take them a little longer. The donkeys are going to be moving slow. She can catch up to them, no problem. But just get moving as quick as you can. See, Abigail knew there was urgency here. There was urgency. She knew what a fool her husband was. And here she is trying to fix what he had done wrong. Trying to somehow remedy the situation. Okay? Because then it says in the end of that verse, in verse 19, but she did not tell her husband Nabal. She didn't bother. Remember, even the servant knew he's a fool, and no one can speak to him. He won't listen. And I just kept thinking, well, we're definitely looking at David. But every time we see David interact with someone else, we start to see other things that maybe we can learn from too. And we never want to be in that position where we're labeled a fool that no one can speak to, because they're just going to do whatever they think. You know, and you start to see the trouble that fool was getting himself into. And here are the people having to orchestrate things around them. Now, sadly, I think it's a little easier for me to think of those fools and know all the people who love them that are quietly trying to fix the mistakes and the things that they're making, and they're trying to somehow make right of the problem. And that's what Abigail was doing. And yet, in the same way, it shows a level of maybe undue respect for her husband. That she's just not even going to bother him with this. At this point, she's just going to try to fix it before any harm comes upon him or his family. She's just going to try to handle this. So it says, then she rode the donkey down a mountain pass hidden from view. And she saw David and his men coming toward her and met them. So she's kind of staying hidden from view, and suddenly here come David and his men. And so she boldly goes out to meet him. And then in verse 21, here it is. So if you didn't believe me before, if you haven't read this in a while, that David was no longer the humble David. His attitude had completely changed. It wasn't as simple as grab my sword. Grab your swords, fellas, because he points it out. David had just said, I guarded everything that belonged to this man in the wilderness for nothing. He was not missing anything, yet he paid me back evil for good. May God punish me and do so severely if I let any of his males survive until morning. If I leave one man alive, see, he intended on wiping every male in the village, in the little, home, whatever, out. Every one of them. He was mad. I mean, he was angry. And can you imagine all the men are just, sometimes I think when he had, when he came across Saul, the men were like, ready, come on, let's get him. Come on, God's delivered him into your hand, David. And David's going, whoa, whoa. So I think probably there were about, 400 men here who were pretty happy. Finally, finally we're going to do something. Finally we're going to handle something. And David is just, he's angry. He is just angry, and he's spouting it off, and so help me if I even let one man live. If I even let one man survive this. He is done. And this is his mindset. Now, I love it. Now, remember it just said, here he comes with his 400 men. Here's the scene. And here she comes. Out of the trees, hidden where she's coming, and she stops him. Just one little woman. Now, I got to say, that says something about a pretty woman, doesn't it? It's going to be, I'm going to go there, okay? Sometimes when men are that angry about the only thing that's going to stop them is a pretty woman. We've got a few people here, and the women are laughing because they know it's true, okay? That something's got to stop him, something's got to catch his attention, okay? And so we can't be too surprised that God used a pretty girl to do it. Now, I know we can go down that path that beauty is on the inside. But what was on the inside of Abigail was not going to stop David, okay? First of all, it was how pretty she was, and then she spoke intelligently. Because we're going to see her logic and the truth that she speaks to David here in a moment. But let's be real. David, what did he say? What was he saying? He was intent on going and killing every man there in that house. Because he had been wronged and he was justified, and he has 400 angry men with him ready to do it. They're all charged. And here she comes. And God had to get his attention. And I love this, because it just tells me that, you know what, whatever path that we decide we're just going to go on, and we let the flesh take over, you know, our God is a good God, and he's apt to send something our direction to try to stop us from whatever that may be that we intend on carrying out in the flesh. But it's just whether or not we're going to listen. It's whether or not we're going to heed whatever that is. You know? And so here David is, and here's Abigail. So in verse 23 it says, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off the donkey and knelt down with her face to the ground and paid homage to David. So she is now acting in the same humble manner, and even more so than when David sent 10 men to her husband to speak to him. Here she is, and she is down on her face before David, humbly. And it says she knelt at his feet and said, the guilt is mine, my lord, but please let your servant speak to you directly. Listen to the words of your servant. So instantly she's saying, listen, the guilt is mine. Like, forget about my husband. Forget about my husband. Like lay it on me. Go ahead. Put it on me. Well, how wise of her. David is intent on killing everyone? No. Just all the men, wasn't he? And now here's this lovely young lady who's saying, it's my fault. Put it on me. Here's the warrior David, ready to go get revenge. And suddenly, it's like somebody just blew out the candle that had been lit, you know. Here's this beautiful woman telling me to blame her for this. I can't blame her. And so she says, please listen to the words that I say. My Lord, in verse 25, should pay no attention to this worthless fool Nabal, for he lives up to his name. His name means stupid, and stupidity is all he knows. I mean, she just lays it out. Listen, I know who I'm married to. I know. I mean, look what his name means. I told you my version's going to say stupid. You look back and the other's going to say fool. But if you look at all the other meanings, stupid. He's just a fool. And here she is, and she says, David, like, please listen to me. Like, you can't even worry. You can't even pay any attention to him. He's a fool. Don't waste your time. You know, I think that so often when we feel somebody has wronged us, if we would stop and think long enough, they're not even worth our time to fight back. Whatever they've said or whatever they've done is probably not even worth our time. It's really not. And I can even say from my own experience, when they are just at you and they've wronged you, and then they want to push your buttons and make you mad, and you kind of take on the attitude of, you know what, no, you're just not worth it. That makes them madder, let me tell you. It does. But most of the time, they're so foolish. The words of Abigail are so true. Don't even give him any thought. He's not worth it. He's a fool, David. So she said, his name means stupid, and stupidity is all he knows. I, your servant, didn't see my Lord's young men whom you sent. She's saying, listen, David, I'm your servant. I'm here. I'm humbly before you. And I'm telling you, I didn't know you sent those men. I didn't see them. I wasn't there. So suddenly this has become all about her. And, and had I known they were there, but I didn't know. So she has his attention. And she says, now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who kept you from participating in bloodshed and avenging yourself by your own hand. Here was Abigail wise enough to know that, listen, this isn't even about me, David. The Lord doesn't want you to do this. The Lord's interceding what you're about to do. because you don't need innocent blood on your hands because you decided to get revenge. You don't need to do this. She said, may your enemies and those who intend to harm my Lord be like Nabal. Let this gift your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. I mean, she is just paying him complete respect and saying, listen, let your enemies be like Nabal. Let them all be fools. Let what they're doing, take care of them. And just please take my offering. Take what I'm bringing to you for you and your men. Please know that once word got to me of your needs and what you've done, I've heard it, and here is my gift that I'm offering to you. And then she says, please forgive your servant's offense. For the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because he fights the Lord's battles. Now, this starts to indicate to us that Abigail was fully aware of who David was. We know that a lot of the trouble that David had started to deal with was based on the fact that he was so popular, and that now he had all of these other men, following with him. And she indicates that she was aware of that when she says, the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because he fights the Lord's battles. She knew whose side David was on. She knew. And she was aware, and I'm sure had intelligently taken in, that it's God who's protecting him, because this just doesn't even make sense. And again, it was pretty widely known that Saul was hunting down David for fear of the kingdom. And she was saying that, listen, I'm sure the Lord's going to fulfill that, and that's what's going to happen. And she's saying, you fight the Lord's battles. This is not one of them. And you know what? When we go down a path of seeking revenge and following whatever our flesh is telling us to do, that is not the Lord's battle. That is not the path we're to be traveling down. That's not the direction we're supposed to be heading. Let's just say the Lord's battle is over here, and now we've lost focus of that one because we're over here fighting the battle of our own flesh and our own desires and what we want to do. And when we do that, even though it seems like it might be a justified path to be on, Satan has distracted us from the real battle, the Lord's battle. And she's reminding him of that. Did you have a thought, Charlie?
I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think there's Abigails today that intervene for their husbands? I know a lot of times men get kind of carried away when they're dealing with another man. But I think sometimes there might be Abigails that kind of just fool a little bit, especially if the guy's bigger than them.
Okay, for those online who maybe couldn't hear, one of the questions was that do we think there are still Abigails today? Those who intervene for their husbands because the husbands get angry and get on a path of maybe destruction or getting even, and the wife maybe steps in and cools the situation down. And to make sure that those who can't see what's happening, that was asked by a man, not a woman, okay? So... Let me clarify that, because some may think, well, of course a woman asked that question. No, a man did. Why? Because it's a man who's probably willing to admit that he knows men go down that path and it can get that anger in them. And I know a couple weeks ago I said that, my husband, he's a big guy, and he can be a really easygoing guy until he's not. And it's like, especially if you mess with his girl, and suddenly we've got the Incredible Hulk here, and he's going through a wall. I mean, you're going down. And yeah, absolutely. And do I think there are still Abigails? I certainly hope so. And I do believe there are, but I certainly hope so. I hope there are women who are calm enough and wise enough to step in and diffuse a situation, to calm a situation. And maybe in that moment, they can't diffuse it with speaking to their own husband. Maybe that comes later. He's too angry right now. So I'm just going to go quietly fix this because I can't speak logic to him right now. He's too upset. But maybe I can go kind of calm it out first and handle it, and then later I'll tell him, which we're going to see she does. It's not like she's totally keeping things from her husband. But does that answer your question? I mean, yeah, definitely. I think that's the case, that there need to be those type of women. To tell you, this one being one of my favorite stories, when I found out that I was going to have a baby, and I was told I couldn't have kids, so that was like, 12 years of marriage and what? And so I figured this was probably only going to be a one-child scenario. And I wanted him or her to have the same initials as her father, his or her father. And so I had picked, it's going to be named after Daddy if it's a boy, and named after Abigail if it's a girl, because that would give me that A. And I loved the story of Abigail. And I thought, what would that be to raise a young lady, teaching her what not just a beautiful but an intelligent young woman does to, solve a problem, to smooth things out, to speak wisdom. And do I think that if one of the other, say the young servant who went to Abigail, do I think that he could have gone out and met David and spoken that to David? No. No, I don't think David would have listened. He would have been ready to kill him. Remember, he said that he was going to kill every single man there was? So God said, well, I can't send one of those. I got to send a girl. Because he wasn't bent or wasn't intent on killing all the women. And so, and like I said, I'm just going to be straight up and real. He sent a pretty one because that catches a man's attention. We know it. Men are visual. And if there isn't that first attraction to stop them, they just don't pay attention. As men, they get carried away with their anger and their thoughts, for sure. So, what they were saying here is, she's saying, listen, you fight the Lord's battles. And this is not one of the Lord's battles. What are you doing? Like, don't do this. She said, throughout your life, may evil not be found in you. Now, she just called her husband a fool. She's just said he's stupid. He lives up to his name. But David, in you, there is no evil. And don't let it start now. Don't let it start now. Someone is pursuing you and intends to take your life. My Lord's life is tucked safely in the place where the Lord your God protects the living. But he is flinging away your enemies' lives like stones from a sling. She's saying, David, listen, God has taken care of every one of your enemies. I've heard the stories. I've heard the rumors. The girls were all talking about David. Let's be real. There was a pretty girl, but the girls all knew who David was. They were all talking about David. And she said, the Lord is just slinging them right off of you, David. You've not had one enemy you've had to encounter. The Lord's protecting you. You don't fight your own battles. And she's encouraging him, keep it that way. Don't do this, okay? She says in verse 30, when the Lord does for my Lord all the good he's promised you and appoints you ruler over Israel. So she's attesting to the fact that, listen, I know who you are, and I know who you're going to become, and I know the Lord's going to do it. And when he does, now this is the important part, in verse 31, when he does, there will not be remorse or a troubled conscience for my Lord because of needless bloodshed or my Lord's revenge. And when the Lord does good things for you, my Lord, may you remember me, your servant. She's saying, listen, for your conscience sake, remember we dealt with that a little bit last week, that his conscience kind of got the best of him when he cut off the corner of Saul's robe, that maybe he shouldn't have done that. And she's saying, listen, for your mental sake, don't do this. You'll live with this for the rest of your life. You'll remember this. You'll regret this. Don't do it. You know what? There are times where maybe the flesh gets the best of us. And there's a song I love to sing. It's called Heal the Wound But Leave the Scars. We're going to have those times in our lives where we look back and we go, why? Why did I do that? And I wish I could take it back. And, we're going to eventually get there. David's life wasn't always like this. He ended up with some of those times where he wished he hadn't done what he did, and he had regrets. But the Lord provided a way out for this one, and I'm sure there was a way out for the other one too. But in this one, David listened to Abigail. And he said to Abigail in verse 32, blessed be the Lord God of Israel who sent you to me today. May your discernment be blessed, and may you be blessed. because today you kept me from participating in bloodshed and avenging myself by my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who prevented me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, Nabal wouldn't have had any males left by morning light. David says, listen, if it hadn't been for you, I would have followed through what I did. And I thank God for you because I know he put you in my path. Did you have a thought, Kathy? Yeah, what Kathy said is she's a negotiator and a peacemaker, and we need a lot of those. And we do. Someone who will, even when there's a wrong that's been done, someone who will stay calm and kind and use logic. And you know, one of the things that when I read this and he talks about her discernment, may your discernment be blessed. And that kind of tells me that he suddenly saw the light that is truth. And there's something to say that all of a sudden, when everyone is in the flesh, there's a lot that's being said and done that's not truth. Okay? When somebody has wronged you and you feel the need to avenge, it's because what they've done has been unfair and untrue and not right. And yet the words of Abigail brought truth to the situation. I look at what's going on in our culture, and when you turn on the news, you just can't even get away from it. And the number one problem is there is not the light of truth. So there's a lot of fighting and a lot of arguing and a lot of back and forth between two different sides, and our country is more divided than ever. And yet, if there could be those calm negotiators, those calm ones that speak truth and diffuse a situation, how much different would it be? And church, as the people of God, that's where we should be. That's the side we should be on. We should never be the one that's seeking revenge or picking a fight or looking like we're just out on a mission to get even with someone. Only we could all learn from Abigail, for sure. So it says in verse 35 that David accepted what she had brought him, and he said, "Go home in peace. See that I have heard what you said, and I have granted your request." So Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was in his house holding a feast fit for a king. He's just having a feast. He has no idea where his wife has been and what she's been doing. Has not a clue. He's just living life and having a party and has no idea that she's been out there saving his life. I mean, you want to talk about stupid. Okay, so his name, yes, is very fitting for him. So it says, here he is holding a feast for a king, and Nabal's heart was cheerful, and he was very drunk. So she didn't say anything to him. She just left. She knew there was no point. I mean, this was a pretty common knowledge in that household. Remember the young servant who said, you can't talk to that man, there's no point. And she's going, well, I certainly can't talk to him when he's drunk and partying. I mean, he's not even in his right mind. So she didn't even waste her time. Once again, we see her wisdom. She's not even going to bother. She's certainly not going to argue with him when he's like that. So it says, in the morning, when Nabal sobered up, his wife told him about these events. And his heart died, and he became a stone. Now, there's a lot of debate among great theologians as to what that means, that his heart died, and he became a stone. But the one thing with all of their surmising that they can agree upon is he was actually afraid. He had realized what was about to take place. I mean, listen, this man, he couldn't have been so dumb that he wasn't aware of how intelligent and discerning his wife was. And here she is logically telling him, this is what I did last night because this was what was about to happen based on what you said and did. And it says his heart became a stone. He was terrified. The fear overcame him. And then it says, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead. Now, to what that means, if his fear, maybe he didn't eat for 10 days, there's a lot of surmising about what happened in that 10-day time period. Do you have a thought? Yes, yes. Yes. Yeah, what she's saying is there was a lack of hospitality, which, yes, in that day was highly looked down upon when you weren't that way. And there was no one that would have argued that he should have graciously given David what he requested. I mean, there was no reason not to. And that's what I'm saying. No one would have argued the fact that David was justified in the fact that he had been wronged. Okay? So there was definitely something wrong. And yes, in that moment when Nabal was no longer drunk and living up life and was just now having a conversation with his very sensible wife, that yeah, he was faced with what he had done wrong. That he had not shown hospitality, that he had not, reached out in this way, and he was faced with that. Yeah, pretty harshly, too. And however we want to take it, I have enough fear of the Lord that when I look at this and it says that the Lord struck him dead, that I know that the Lord holds our lives in his hand. And I'm not saying he brings about every bad thing, but I have enough fear of the Lord to say, you know what? I'm going to try to toe the line and be careful what I do. Because there are things he very heavily looks down upon. And I think that's another thing over the years is, we talk so much about God is love, and he is. And nothing has changed. The greatest of these is love. But our God is still a just God and somebody to be feared. And so it says, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who championed my cause against Nabal's insults and restrained his servant from doing evil. The Lord brought Nabal's evil deeds back on his own head." I don't think this was an angry or arrogant David who made this response. This was a humble David who now realized that here I was about to go and take matters into my own hands. And I didn't. I was spared from doing that. And God handled it for me. God took care of the one who had done me wrong himself. And once again, I think David was greatly humbled by seeing the Lord's care of him. And that the Lord would fight his battles, and the Lord would get revenge. And over again, that is a running theme in the Psalms, that even though I didn't have one that I could convincingly say David wrote in accordance with this event, we know that David knew that vengeance was God's, not his. And David over and over again said, the Lord is going to fight my battles, the Lord will take revenge, and I will just rest in his care. And David was about to stray from that and handle things, and yet was stopped. And now he's going, here it is again. The Lord took care of the one who did wrong. So it says, David sent messengers to speak to Abigail about marrying him. And when David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David sent us to bring you to him as a wife." So she stood up and paid homage with her face to the ground. So here she is humbly on the ground. And she said, "Here I am, your servant, a slave to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Then Abigail got up quickly, and with her 5 female servants accompanying her, rode on the donkey following David's messengers. And so she became his wife. Here was David, who then is in this state of going, okay, wow, kind of feel like I was part of this, because here I am protecting his shepherds, and then I go and I ask food of him, and he declines and mistreats me, and, here she so graciously and kindly and humbly came to me. Now her husband's dead. And now custom back then would have been, who's going to take care of her? She wasn't necessarily going to be able to take care of herself. But she was cute, exactly, she was beautiful, exactly. And again, I'm sorry, men are just not that difficult. She was pretty, and he couldn't get her out of his head. And remember, she knew an awful lot about him as well. And I didn't see that there was a whole lot of love for her husband. Again, those marriages back then were very arranged and just what they were. But David, now being a man of honor, steps in and sends men to go ask her and say he's requesting her as his wife. And she humbly agrees to go back to him. Now, The end of this chapter ends, and this is where we will go next week, okay? The end of this chapter ends with, the fact that there was another wife in David's life, and that one was probably before Abigail. However, the last verse says, now here's this little caveat, okay? But Saul, remember him? Remember the real problem in David's life? It was not Nabal. But Saul gave his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltai, son of Laish, who was from Galim. So remember, David used to be Saul's son-in-law. David was married to Michal, who loved him. And our last, interaction between David and Saul felt such remorse for how he had treated David. And he showed honor to David. And David, you've been more righteous than I. We get a little taste here that this was not done for Saul. And this was a direct insult to David and a direct dig at David to take David's wife, Saul's daughter, and give her to another man. Saul wasn't done yet. And we'll see that there is another interaction between David and Saul once again in the next chapter. But, see, David was in the right place with Saul. David was humble with Saul. David knew, I'm not laying a hand on Saul, but so quickly the flesh rose up with Nabal. And yet God provided a way out. And if only we will look at that and think, you know what, before I let the flesh take over and I start to react or seek to get even on my own, before I draw my sword, that wicked one we have called the tongue, is that fighting the Lord's battle or our own? And David was given counsel by a very wise woman that you need to fight the Lord's battles. This isn't it. Go another direction. And definitely, as many of you had pointed out, a great example in Abigail of the spirit we should have when we are in those situations, a spirit of, compromise and a spirit of, just calmness, in the midst of a battle. So I think those of you who are here in person and those who are here in the virtual realm, and hopefully, we'll build this up and, get more people feeling comfortable coming out. But either way, I thank you for being here tonight. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we thank you for these examples of people, not anybody in a superhero type fashion, but just real people that, lived a life with the same struggles and the same challenges that we face. And I thank you for preserving them in your word, these stories that we can learn and grow from, ones that we can relate to and understand maybe how they were feeling and think of those times in our life where we have felt like we're in that same place. And yet, Lord, I thank you for showing the fact that you care about even those little things, that you desire to keep us in right relationship with you, and that you try to come alongside us and stop us and send people our direction to intercede in a way that would direct us away from maybe things we would do wrong. And I thank you for caring about all those little things. And I pray that we would learn from this passage and glean from it some wisdom in how we deal with matters in our everyday life. And I think, Lord, of that nasty, nasty sword that we pull, the tongue. I just pray, Lord, that you would help us, especially with things in our world, things in our country, just so volatile right now. Everybody's so quick to be angry and fight and argue aside. I pray that you would help us to put our sword away and help us to be calm. Help us to speak truth like Abigail did. Help us not to be looking for a fight, but being one that would want to find peace, that we would seek peace, and that we would always be aware of the battles that we fight for you and not be engaged in ones that would be unpleasing to you. Pray, Lord, that as we even think of that you would be with our country, be with our leaders, be with our president. Whether we agree with who these leaders are or not, they are still the ones that are in that place and in that position. And because of that, there is a certain respect, Lord, that you've told us to have. And I pray that you would be with them and watch over them and speak to them, Lord, and give them wisdom from you. I thank you for the God that you are. In your holy and precious name, amen.